The suitcase hit the sidewalk before Nancy did. It landed hard. One wheel cracked. The sound echoed across the quiet cul-de-sac like a gunshot. Nancy Mitchell stood frozen in the yellow porch light of the house she had cleaned, decorated, and filled with 38 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, burnt casseroles, science fair posters, flu nights, prom photos, and whispered prayers. Now, it wasn't her house anymore. At 67 years old, with the smell of fresh-cut grass in the evening air and the sharp sting of her own tears drying on her skin, Nancy watched her ex-husband carry another woman's garment bags through the front door. Not a stranger. His new wife. 30 years younger. Bright smile. Smooth skin. High heels clicking on the same hardwood floors Nancy had polished on her knees. And Richard laughed. Actually laughed, as if this were easy, as if this were clean, as if a marriage could be folded up like winter clothes and packed away before dark. Nancy tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase until her fingers ached, because this was the moment everything became real. Not the papers, not the signatures, not the attorney sliding a check across a polished desk. This. Her standing on the sidewalk with one suitcase, one jewelry box, 2 photo albums, and $30,000, while the man she had built a life around moved on before the porch light had even cooled. And the worst part was not that Richard left. It was that everyone acted like she should be grateful, because Nancy didn't know it yet, but that cracked sidewalk was the first piece of ground she would ever truly stand on. Just make it to spring. Richard came back out carrying another box. He wore a blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, the same look he used when he wanted to seem approachable, human, reasonable. He glanced at Nancy like she was an inconvenience that hadn't quite finished loading. "You got the check," he said. "That should help you get settled." "Help you get settled." Nancy looked at him, really looked at him, and for a second she saw all 38 years stacked inside his face. The college boy with easy confidence, the young husband with big plans, the ambitious businessman, the man who slowly stopped asking what she wanted, the man who replaced we with mine, the man who moved money quietly while she still thought they were going to therapy. The cicadas buzzed in the oak trees above them. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. The whole neighborhood smelled like warm brick, gasoline, and the faint sweetness of somebody's gardenias. "Nancy," Richard said, impatient now, "you should probably go before it gets dark." "Go," from her house. Her throat tightened, but her voice came out strangely calm. "I planted the dogwoods out front," she said. Richard blinked. "What? The dogwoods?" "They were 6 inches tall when I planted them. David was 8. Rebecca helped me water them." Melissa appeared in the doorway behind him, holding a wine glass. "Richard, do you want me to?" "No," Nancy said, not loudly but sharply enough that Melissa stopped. For one long second, nobody moved. Then Richard exhaled through his nose, annoyed. "Don't do this. Do this." Like grief was a performance. Like humiliation was bad manners. Nancy nodded once, because if she spoke again, she might scream. She bent, lifted the broken suitcase, and walked toward her car. Behind her, she heard the front door close. Not slam, just close, softly. That somehow hurt more. The motel room smelled like bleach, old carpet, and stale coffee grounds. Nancy sat on the edge of the bed in her polyester blouse and sensible slacks, staring at the floral bedspread while the air conditioner rattled like it might die at any second. The lamp beside her buzzed faintly. Outside, tires hissed over wet pavement. She had not cried in the car. She had not cried at the lawyer's office. She had not cried while carrying her suitcase into room 214 of the Carolina Pines extended stay. But now, with the door locked and the silence pressing in from all sides, she opened the envelope again and counted the money on paper as if the number might change. $30,000. That was what 38 years had been reduced to. $30,000 after Richard kept the house, the late property, the vehicles, the business accounts, the club membership, and the loyalty of both children. Nancy pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. She had once known the Latin names of desert shrubs. She had once written papers on drought adaptation and root depth strategy. She had once stood in a greenhouse with dirt under her nails and a whole future in front of her. Now she was calculating how long she could survive in a motel with a mini fridge and a microwave that smelled faintly like burned noodles. She picked up the phone and called her son. David answered on the fourth ring. "Hey, Mom." His voice was casual, distracted. She could hear keyboard clicking in the background. "I'm at a motel," Nancy said. I wanted to tell you I'm okay." A pause. Then, "Okay. Good." Nancy waited. He didn't fill the silence. "Your father moved her in already," she said quietly. David sighed, the way people sigh when they think someone is being difficult in a grocery line. "Mom, I really don't want to get in the middle." Nancy stared at the nicotine yellow ceiling. "The middle? You know what I mean. This is between you and Dad." Nancy laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Between me and Dad? David, I raised you in that house." "I know, but legally." There it was, legally. Her son kept talking, voice flattening into the language of people who prefer rules to pain. "The house was in Dad's name. He gave you $30,000. Honestly, that's more generous than he had to be." Nancy felt the room tilt just slightly, not because she had never imagined this, because part of her had. And still, hearing it out loud from her own child was like touching a live wire. "The house is worth $400,000, she said. "Mom, please, don't do the math thing. It won't help." The math thing, as if fairness were a hobby she needed to drop. As if decades of unpaid labor, abandoned education, and invisible loyalty could be dismissed with a phrase. Nancy closed her eyes. When David was 6, he used to crawl into her lap during thunderstorms and bury his face in her neck. When he was 12, she stayed up 3 nights in a row while he had pneumonia. When he was 19, she mailed him grocery money and never told Richard. And now this. "You sound like him," she whispered. "Mom." But she had already hung up. The motel room felt smaller. The rain came harder outside, tapping the window in uneven bursts. Nancy stood and crossed to it. Red taillights smeared across the wet parking lot. A neon vacancy sign hummed in pink and blue. Her reflection looked older than she remembered. Not old, just erased around the edges. Rebecca's call the next morning was somehow worse because her daughter sounded gentle. "Mom, I'm worried about you." Nancy sat at the tiny motel table with instant coffee going cold between her hands. Why? Because buying time in a motel and spiraling isn't a plan. Nancy almost smiled. "Spiraling, such a tidy word." "I'm not spiraling. I think you are," Rebecca said softly. "Dad says you're taking this harder than expected." Nancy stared at the wall. Of course he said that, because if she was emotional, then he could stay rational. If she was unstable, then he could stay justified. "I'm taking this exactly as hard as it deserves," Nancy said. Rebecca lowered her voice. "Mom, Melissa is here now. Dad's trying to move forward. You should try to do the same. Move forward." Nancy looked down at her wedding ring still sitting in the dish beside the coffee cup. She had taken it off last night. The pale indentation on her finger looked almost obscene. "Did you know?" Nancy asked. Silence. Not long. Long enough. Rebecca inhaled carefully. "I knew they were having problems. That's not what I asked." Another silence. Then, too quietly, "I knew there was someone." Nancy shut her eyes. There are heartbreaks that shatter loudly. And then there are heartbreaks that arrive like a small, careful confession from your daughter over motel coffee while the ice machine rattles outside your door. Those are worse, because they don't explode. They sink, deep, cold, permanent. After the call ended, Nancy sat still for nearly an hour. Then she opened her old email, then an old folder, then another, and buried under years of recipes, school newsletters, and forwarded family photos, she found the scanned copy of a paper she had written at North Carolina State in 1980. Adaptive cultivation strategies for arid soil in the Piedmont region. Her own name sat at the top. Nancy Mitchell. Not Mrs. Richard Mitchell. Not mom. Not supportive spouse. Not dependent. Just Nancy. She read the first paragraph once, then twice. Outside, the rain had stopped. Light broke through the clouds in thin white bands, making the motel parking lot shine. Somewhere in the distance, she could smell wet earth rising warm from the ground. And for the first time in weeks, something flickered. Not hope, not yet. Something smaller. Recognition. That afternoon, while searching for apartments she could not afford, Nancy found a listing so ridiculous she clicked it just to prove how ridiculous it was. 5 acres, rural Chatham County, $8,000. Unimproved land, no utilities, no water, no road, dry, rocky, unusable. There were only 3 photos. Cracked clay, scrub brush, a patch of stubborn green in the far corner where runoff must have collected after storms. Anyone else would have seen wasteland. Nancy leaned closer to the screen. Then closer, because underneath the listing language, underneath the neglect, underneath the insult of that cheap, abandoned dirt, she saw something else. And the next morning, with a motel key on the table and her whole life reduced to what fit inside a trunk, Nancy turned the ignition and drove toward land nobody wanted. Because sometimes the first sign of a second life looks exactly like a mistake. Just make it to spring. By the time Nancy turned off the highway, the sky had gone the color of worn denim. Clouds hung low over Chatham County, thick and bruised at the edges, and the road narrowed from smooth pavement to patched asphalt, then to gravel that popped under her tires like dry bones. The air changed out there. Less exhaust, more pine, more mud, more rain still hiding somewhere in the ditches. Nancy rolled the window down halfway and breathed in wet leaves, clay, and the faint mineral smell of earth that had been cracked open too many summers in a row. Her motel coffee sat untouched in the cup holder, cold now. Her knuckles were stiff on the steering wheel. This was foolish. That thought had been tapping at her ever since she left the motel. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Foolish to drive 40 minutes to look at land she couldn't live on. Foolish to think 5 forgotten acres could matter when her whole life had just been dismantled in a lawyer's office and thrown onto a curb. But foolish was beginning to feel better than ashamed. The listing had sent her to a rusted gate leaning sideways beside a ditch full of cattails. No sign. No mailbox. Just a faded orange ribbon tied to a fence post and a muddy stretch of tire tracks disappearing between scrub pines. Nancy parked on the shoulder. For a moment she just sat there and listened. Wind moving through dry grass. A crow somewhere overhead. The ticking engine cooling under the hood. Then she stepped out. The ground gave under her flats immediately. Red clay clung to the edges of her shoes. Her slacks brushed against weeds damp from last night's rain. Somewhere nearby, water trickled unseen through a culvert. She pushed past the gate and walked onto the property. It was worse than the listing. The front half was a mess of scrub brush, thorny vines, and rock-stiff ground that looked baked and punished. A few stunted pines leaned like they had grown up fighting for light. Broken bottles glittered near the tree line. Old rusted wire curled out of the dirt like bones from a grave. Nancy stopped. A sane person would have turned around. A sane person would have laughed, gotten back in the car, and driven straight to an apartment complex with beige siding and a leasing office and a little plastic sign promising resort-style amenities. But Nancy kept walking. Because the farther she went, the more she noticed small things. A slope in the land, a low area where runoff collected, the kind of grass growing in patches instead of dying outright, the color variation in the soil. She crouched carefully and touched the ground with her fingertips, dry at the top, cooler beneath. The old instincts came back so fast it startled her. Texture, drainage, exposure, shade line, water memory. For years she had trained herself not to think this way. Richard had called her college work that plant phase, with a smile that always landed like a thumb pressing down. Life got busy. Babies came. Bills came. Richard's business took off. Her classes became impractical, then poorly timed, then something maybe later. Later never came. And yet here it was now, rising in her like a language she hadn't spoken in decades but still understood perfectly. This part holds moisture longer, she murmured aloud, surprising herself. Well, I sure hope so, because the rest of it looks like the moon. Nancy straightened too fast and nearly lost her footing. A woman stood 20 feet away with a canvas feed bag on one shoulder, muddy boots, and a face that looked sun-worn in the kindest possible way. Her silver curls were tucked under a University of North Carolina baseball cap. A basset hound with drooping eyes and absurdly short legs stood beside her, panting like the entire walk had offended him personally. The woman lifted a hand. Didn't mean to scare you. I came through the back trail. I'm June Harper. I own the property on the other side. Nancy put a hand to her chest. Nancy Mitchell. June's eyes flicked over the car at the road, the sensible shoes, the department store blouse, the expression Nancy probably hadn't managed to rearrange into confidence. You here to buy this disaster? June asked. Nancy gave a brittle laugh. I'm here to look at it. That's how it starts. The dog waddled forward and leaned one warm side against Nancy's shin as if introductions were beneath him. This is Pickles, June said. He likes women with heartbreak. Makes him feel useful. For the first time in days, Nancy smiled without forcing it. June noticed. There she is. Thought you might still be in there somewhere. Nancy looked down at the dog. Is it that obvious? June adjusted the feed bag higher on her shoulder. Honey, I'm 69. I can smell fresh betrayal farther than rain. Nancy let out a surprised little laugh, and the sound seemed to loosen something in her ribs. The wind shifted. Pine and damp clay mixed with the smell of dog fur and the faint sweetness of cracked wild onions underfoot. June stepped beside her and scanned the property. Folks say this land's useless. Hard pan under the top layer. No utilities. Poor access. Too dry in July. Too slick in February. Nancy nodded. That's what the listing says. June glanced sideways at her. And what do you say? Nancy stared out over the rough 5 acres. A mockingbird trilled from somewhere deep in the brush, then went silent. I think, she said slowly, it's not useless. June's eyebrows rose. Nancy pointed toward the low end of the property. Water comes through there. Not enough to see today, but enough to feed root growth. The back section gets different light than the front. And those scrub patches, she stepped forward studying them. Something survives here repeatedly, which means the land isn't dead, it's just been ignored. June went quiet. Then she smiled, not politely, not skeptically, knowingly. Well, she said, now that is a thing worth hearing before breakfast. Nancy looked embarrassed suddenly. I used to study this sort of thing. Used to? The question landed harder than it should have. Nancy swallowed. A long time ago, June bent, picked a stem of wild grass, and rolled it between her fingers. You know, land and women have that in common. Nancy looked at her. June tossed the grass aside. People neglect them for years, then call them barren. The words settled into the air between them. Nancy didn't answer, couldn't, because something about hearing her private grief translated into plain country language by a stranger in muddy boots made it feel more true than anything her children had said, more honest than anything Richard had ever admitted. Pickles sneezed violently at a tuft of weeds, then sat down as if he'd solved something. June laughed. Come on, I've got iced tea in the truck and exactly one folding chair. You can stand and be dignified, or sit on a feed bucket and tell me why you drove out here looking like you haven't slept in a week. Nancy should have refused. She knew that. A careful person would have said thank you, maybe taken a business card, maybe gone back to the motel and resumed the practical work of shrinking her life into something affordable. But careful had not protected her. Careful had made her disappear. So 20 minutes later, Nancy was sitting on an overturned mineral bucket beside June Harper's truck. drinking tea so cold the glass sweated into her hand, while pickles slept across both their feet and the late morning sun burned through the clouds. And she told her, not all of it, just enough. The marriage, the house, the suitcase, the children siding with Richard, the $30,000 spoken about like charity. June listened without interrupting. No fake sympathy, no performative outrage, just quiet attention and an occasional nod. When Nancy finished, the breeze moved through the pines with a low rushing sound, almost like ocean water. June took a sip of tea. So, Nancy stared at the property again. So what? So you buying it? Nancy blinked. I can't live on this land. Didn't ask that. Nancy gave a tired shake of her head. It would be irresponsible. June smiled. Maybe. But I noticed you didn't say impossible. Nancy looked down at the sweating glass in her hand. On the road beyond the gate, a truck passed and disappeared. A hawk circled high above the open patch near the back corner. Light flashed across the clay in broken gold strips. Irresponsible, impossible, different words, very different lives. Nancy exhaled slowly. Because for the first time since the suitcase hit the sidewalk, something unexpected had happened. No one here knew Richard. No one here knew Melissa. No one here knew the version of Nancy who was supposed to take the check, lower her eyes, and vanish gracefully. Out here, on land nobody wanted, she was not an inconvenience. She was a woman looking at possibility. And that frightened her almost as much as it thrilled her. June set down her glass. I'll tell you one thing, Nancy Mitchell. Nancy turned. June nodded toward the property. If you walk away from this, make sure it's because you truly don't want it. A beat. Not because someone spent 38 years teaching you not to want anything. Nancy felt that line all the way down to her hands. And as the wind moved over the scarred red dirt, carrying the smell of sun-warmed weeds and wet clay, she realized something that would change everything. She had not driven out there to inspect the land. She had driven out there to inspect herself, and what she found was not finished. She told herself, just make it to spring. Nancy bought the land on a Thursday. No celebration, no champagne, no children calling to say they were proud of her, no friend taking a photo in front of a sold sign. Just a folding chair in a cramped county office, a fluorescent light that buzzed overhead, the smell of paper dust and copier toner, and a clerk with tired eyes who slid the documents across the desk and said, initial here, here, and here. Nancy signed her name with a pen that scratched. Nancy Mitchell. The letters looked stronger now, still shaky around the edges, still unfamiliar, but stronger. When it was done, she walked outside clutching a manila envelope and stood in the cold January sunlight as if she expected the earth to tilt beneath her feet. 5 acres of rough land in Chatham County. $8,000 gone from her settlement, leaving $22,000 to survive on. She should have felt panic first. She did feel panic. It came fast and hot right under the ribs. What have you done? What kind of woman buys dirt instead of security? What kind of 67-year-old starts over with no house, no plan, and no one to catch her? A pickup roared past the courthouse square, country music thumping through open windows. Somewhere nearby, someone was frying onions. The smell drifted out from a diner and mixed with exhaust and winter air. Nancy shut her eyes. Then June's voice came back to her. Make sure you walk away because you don't want it, not because someone trained you not to want anything. Nancy opened her eyes again. No, this fear was real. But it was not a warning. It was withdrawal from a lifetime of permission. And that was different. Just make it to spring. The next week was chaos disguised as errands. Nancy left the motel for good and rented the cheapest month-to-month room she could find above an old hardware store in town. The staircase smelled like sawdust, frying grease from the restaurant next door, and old rain trapped in wood. The room itself had slanted ceilings, one narrow bed, and a radiator that hissed all night like it was gossiping about her. But it had a window, and from that window she could see the courthouse clock, a barbershop pole, and people walking with purpose. Teenagers with backpacks. A woman carrying tulips. A man sweeping the front step of his bakery before sunrise. Life moving, not ending, not pausing for her humiliation, just moving. Nancy made lists on the back of grocery receipts. Water access, temporary shelter, property tax, used tools, seeds later, soil first. Stretch money, no mistakes. But mistakes came anyway. The first was a man named Curtis Bell who sold her a dented used generator at a widow's price, which she later learned meant exactly 3 times what it was worth. The second was a delivery of cinder blocks dropped at the wrong edge of the property, forcing Nancy to haul them one by one in shoes not meant for mud, her lower back screaming with every trip. The third was believing she could clear brush by herself for 4 straight hours. By the end of day 2, her palms were blistered, her shoulders throbbed, and red clay had dried in hard flakes on her pant legs, inside her cuffs, and across the lines of her hands like she had been marked by the land itself. June found her sitting on an upside-down bucket, staring at a handsaw like it had personally betrayed her. "Told you," June said, stepping out of her truck. Nancy looked up, exhausted. "About what?" "That survival is deeply inconvenient." Pickles barked once from the passenger seat, then refused to get down until June physically lifted his long, offended body to the ground. Nancy laughed weakly. "I may have made a terrible mistake." June scanned the half-cleared patch, the crooked stack of blocks, the broken rake handle, and Nancy's dirt-smeared face. "Nah," she said. "You just at the ugly stage." "The ugly stage?" "Everything worth building has one. House, garden, new identity. All ugly before they turn." June handed her a wrapped biscuit still warm from a diner in town. Buttery steam drifted up when Nancy opened the paper, rich and salty and almost enough to make her cry. They sat on overturned buckets and ate in the pale noon sun while a chainsaw buzzed somewhere on a distant property line and crows argued in the pines. "I used to think people who started over were brave," Nancy said quietly. June snorted. "Most of them are just cornered." Nancy looked over. June shrugged. "Bravery gets too much credit. Desperation does most of the heavy lifting." That stayed with Nancy the rest of the day, because it felt true. She was not fearless. She was not radiant. She was not discovering herself beneath some golden cinematic sunset. She was cold, sore, underfunded, and furious enough to keep going. Sometimes that's the better fuel. 2 weeks later, Richard called. Nancy was standing in the hardware store comparing the prices of PVC pipe fittings when his name lit up her phone screen. For 1 second, the W, her thumb hovered. The store smelled like fertilizer, rubber hoses, machine oil, and popcorn from a little red cart near the register. Country radio played overhead, cheerful and irritating. She answered. "Nancy." Richard's voice was smooth, as if he were calling about dinner reservations instead of the wreckage of a marriage. "What do you want?" she asked. A pause. He clearly hadn't expected that. "I heard you bought land." Nancy said nothing. He continued, adopting the patient tone he used whenever he wanted to sound reasonable and make her sound unstable by comparison. "David mentioned it. Nancy, that's not a practical decision." There it was again. Practical. That word Richard used like a leash. Nancy stared at a row of seed trays stacked in spring colors she couldn't afford yet. "It's done," she said. "You need to be careful. You don't know what you're doing." And for one tiny perfect second, Nancy almost believed him. Almost. Then she looked down at her cart. Work gloves. Twine. A used spade head. Pipe connectors. A notebook full of measurements. And beneath Richard's voice, beneath his certainty, beneath the old ache of being managed, something rose in her chest that had not lived there in years. Anger with a spine. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. Richard laughed softly, not kindly. "No, Nancy, you're reacting." She gripped the phone harder. At the register, a little boy begged his mother for a packet of marigold seeds. Someone dropped the box of nails in the next aisle, and the metallic scatter rang through the store. Nancy spoke slowly. You moved your wife into my house before the porch light cooled. Our house, he corrected automatically. Nancy smiled, actually smiled, because there it was, the truth hiding in plain sight. When the labor was needed, it had been their house. When the ownership mattered, it became his. She said, funny how the pronouns change depending on who benefits. Silence. Then his voice sharpened. I'm trying to help you avoid embarrassment. Nancy looked straight ahead at the greenhouse plastic hanging near the seasonal display, the translucent sheets glowing under white lights like thin ice. And suddenly she understood. This was not concern. This was maintenance. Richard did not want her safe. He wanted her small enough to stay understandable. He wanted the old Nancy, the one who apologized before wanting anything, the one who mistook endurance for love. Nancy lowered her voice. You don't get to protect me from a life you created. Then she hung up. Her whole body trembled, not from fear, from release. At the register, the cashier, a teenage girl with a silver nose ring and a name tag that read Emma, looked at Nancy and said, that sounded satisfying. Nancy blinked, then laughed, helpless and bright. It was, she admitted. Emma grinned. Good. It was a tiny moment, a nothing moment, just a hardware store checkout and a stranger with gum tucked in her cheek. But for Nancy, it felt like a door opening somewhere inside her. Witness matters, even from strangers, especially from strangers. February arrived mean and wet. Cold rain turned the property to slick red sludge. The access path became nearly impassable, and the temporary tarp structure Nancy had rigged over her supplies tore loose in a windstorm and flapped all night like a sail trying to escape. One morning she found 2 bins of tools tipped over, a bag of lime split open in the mud, and 3 weeks of careful progress turned into a soaked mess. The discouragement hit so hard she had to sit down in the rain. She didn't cry immediately. First she tried to fix things. That was her old instinct. Tidy it, lift it, carry it, smile through it. But the tarp kept slapping loose. Her hands were numb. Her jeans were soaked through at the knees. The ground sucked at her boots like it wanted to pull her under. Then she saw the seed notebook, open, wet, ink bleeding into blue ghosts across the page. That did it. Nancy dropped to the muddy ground and cried with a sound so raw it startled even her. Rain pattered on the tarp scraps. Wind hissed through the pines. Her own breath came in ragged pulls, visible in the cold. I can't do this, she whispered to nobody. I can't do this. Sure you can, said a voice behind her. You're just not enjoying it. Nancy turned. June stood there in a raincoat the color of mustard, holding a thermos in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. Pickles wore a child-sized yellow slicker and looked humiliated by God. Nancy let out a broken laugh through tears. June trudged over, set down the thermos, and crouched beside her in the mud without hesitation. Here's the rule, June said. You get 10 minutes to fall apart. Then we tie things down and keep moving. Nancy wiped at her face. That's a terrible rule. It's an excellent rule. I made it during my second divorce. Despite herself, Nancy laughed again. June poured coffee into the thermos lid. It smelled strong and burnt and alive. Nancy took it in both hands and let the heat bite into her fingers. Above them, the gray sky pressed low. Rain tapped and drummed and slid. The whole world smelled like wet pine bark, iron, and split earth. Why are you helping me? Nancy asked quietly. June looked at her like the answer was obvious. Because someone should have. That landed deep. Deeper than comfort. Deeper than pity. Because for years nobody had asked what Nancy needed before she broke. They waited until after. After the sacrifice. After the compromise. After the vanishing. But June kept showing up before the collapse finished its work. And that kind of kindness is dangerous. It makes a person start believing they might be worth saving. By the first week of March, the land finally began to answer back. Not with miracles, with signs. The drainage trench Nancy and June dug by hand actually held. The test patch of amended soil near the back edge stayed dark longer between rains. Tiny green shoots appeared where Nancy had scattered an early cover mix almost as an experiment. Little things. Easy to miss. Life usually arrives that way first. Nancy crouched over the patch in the late afternoon light, touching one fragile sprout with the gentlest edge of her finger. Wind moved warm for the first time in weeks. Birds chattered in the brush. The clay smelled softer now, less angry. Somewhere behind her, Pickles snored in the shade of June's truck tire. Nancy smiled. A real one. Not because everything was fixed. Not because the money problem had disappeared. Not because the loneliness was gone, but because the land was speaking, and she could still hear it. Then her phone buzzed. Rebecca. Nancy wiped her hands on her jeans and answered. Hello? Her daughter sounded breathless, shaken. Mom, I didn't know who else to call. Nancy stood slowly. In the background, she heard a child crying. Then another sound, a cough. Thin, fragile, wrong. Rebecca whispered, It's Lily. She can't keep anything down, and I have to get to the ER, but Mark's out of town and Nancy was already reaching for her keys. Because whatever else had broken between them, one thing had not. When someone vulnerable needed help, Nancy moved. And she had no idea that the drive she was about to make would uncover the first real crack in Richard's perfect version of the past. She told herself, just make it to spring. She told herself, just make it to spring. Nancy drove too fast. Not recklessly, not wildly, but with the kind of focus that turns every red light into an insult. The sky was already dimming, bruised purple over the tree line, and the last of the rain had left the road slick and shiny. Headlights stretched in long white smears across the pavement. Wind hissed under the car. The heater clicked and blew air that smelled faintly dusty, like every old system forced awake after a long silence. Rebecca's neighborhood was 23 minutes away. Nancy made it in 17. When she pulled into the driveway, the front door was already open. Rebecca stood there barefoot in leggings and an oversized sweatshirt, one hand on the frame, the other pressing a dish towel against her shoulder like she had forgotten it was there. Her hair was half up, half fallen out. Her face looked young in the worst possible way, scared young. Nancy barely got the car into park before Rebecca rushed down the steps. She's in the back room, she said. She keeps throwing up. She's so hot, Mom. She's burning up. Nancy was already moving. The house smelled like baby shampoo, sour stomach acid, damp laundry, and the faint cinnamon scent of a candle someone had lit hours ago and forgotten to blow out. Toys lay scattered across the living room rug. A cartoon played too loudly in the den to no one at all. Somewhere, a washing machine beeped and then beeped again, unclaimed. Caregiving chaos. Nancy knew this landscape better than she knew her own reflection. She stepped into the back bedroom and saw Lily immediately, 5 years old, curled sideways on the bed, cheeks flushed too bright, hair stuck damply to her temples, and the sound coming out of her, that weak little moan, that exhausted whimper, went straight through Nancy like a knife. Grandma, Lily whispered when she saw her. Nancy crossed the room in 2 steps and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under her weight. She touched Lily's forehead, too hot, not feverish hot, dangerously hot. The bedside lamp threw a soft yellow pool over the tangled blankets. The room smelled of children's medicine, sweat, and saltine crackers gone stale in an open sleeve. A humidifier rattled in the corner, puffing out thin white mist that smelled faintly medicinal. When did this start? Nancy asked. Rebecca stood in the doorway hugging herself. This morning she said her tummy hurt. Then she threw up after lunch. Then again. Then she couldn't keep water down. Then she got sleepy and I didn't know if I was overreacting. You're not, Nancy said sharply but not unkindly. Get her shoes, a towel, a change of clothes. Rebecca blinked, relieved just to be given direction. Nancy turned back to Lily. Sweetheart, we're going for a little ride, okay? Lily whimpered. I don't want the doctor. I know, Nancy said softly, smoothing damp hair away from her face. But I'm going with you. And I'm not leaving. Something in Lily's tiny body loosened at that. Not trust in the hospital. Trust in Nancy. And Rebecca saw it. Nancy felt her daughter seeing it from the doorway. That old, forgotten truth. When the room turned chaotic, Nancy steadied it. Always had. Always would. She told herself, just make it to spring. The emergency room was all fluorescent light and waiting. Antiseptic. Coffee gone bitter on a warming plate. Rubber soles squeaking across polished floors. Muted television in the corner showing weather nobody watched. Lily lay against Nancy's chest in the chair, limp with exhaustion, while Rebecca filled out forms at the intake desk with shaking hands. Nancy could feel the child's heat right through both layers of clothing. Every now and then Lily stirred and made a weak sound in her throat that tightened every muscle in Nancy's body. A nurse called them back. There were questions, symptoms, timing, fluid intake, urine output, fever pattern. Rebecca tried to answer, but her voice kept catching. Nancy stepped in where she could, calm and exact. Yes, since late afternoon. No, she hasn't kept fluids down. Yes, she's more lethargic than usual. No rash, no known allergies. The doctor moved quickly after that. Dehydration. Possible viral infection. Need to monitor. Need fluids. Lily cried when they placed the IV. Rebecca cried too, though more quietly. Nancy stood at the side of the bed, one hand on Lily's leg, her own heart pounding with that old specific helplessness only caregivers know, the agony of not being able to trade places with the suffering body in front of you. The curtain around the room swayed every time someone passed in the hallway. Machines beeped softly. Somewhere nearby, a baby wailed. The air was too cold and smelled too clean. Grandma, Lily whimpered again. I'm right here. Her voice did not shake. That was the thing about Nancy. Even when she was shattered, she knew how to sound like safety. Hours later, when the fever came down enough for Lily to sleep, Rebecca slid into the plastic chair beside Nancy and covered her face with both hands. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Nancy looked at her. For what? Rebecca lowered her hand slowly. Her mascara had smudged beneath her eyes. She looked ashamed, exhausted, like a woman who had finally run out of surfaces to balance on. For all of it, she said. For not calling sooner. For the motel. For repeating what Dad said. For acting like you were the one making this ugly. Nancy said nothing. Rebecca stared at Lily sleeping beneath the hospital blanket, then swallowed hard. I didn't want to see it, she said, because if I saw it clearly, then I'd have to admit what he did. There it was, not an excuse, a truth. And sometimes truth arrives too late to be comforting. Nancy leaned back in the chair. Your father has always been good at making his decisions sound inevitable. Rebecca let out one humorless breath. Yes. The machine beside Lily continued its steady electronic rhythm. Green line, soft beep. Green line, soft beep. Rebecca looked over at Nancy carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might still bolt. He told us you agreed to the settlement because you said you didn't want to fight. Nancy turned her head slowly. The room seemed to narrow. What? Rebecca frowned, already sensing something shift. He said you wanted it done quickly, that you said the house paperwork was complicated and you didn't care about ownership as long as things stayed peaceful. Nancy stared at her. The hospital air felt suddenly thinner. I never said that. Rebecca blinked. But he said, I know what he said. The words came out flat, controlled, dangerous in their calm, because this was not about being cruel anymore. This was not about infidelity. This was not about humiliation. This was about narrative. Richard had not only taken more, he had pre-written the story so everyone would believe Nancy gave it away willingly. Nancy looked back at Lily, sleeping with her mouth slightly open, damp curls stuck to her forehead. The sight grounded her just enough to stay still. Did you see any paperwork? Nancy asked quietly. Rebecca hesitated. No. Did David? I don't know. Nancy nodded once. The doctor came in then with an update. Viral gastritis most likely. Fluids were helping. They'd observe a little longer, then send Lily home if she continued improving. Rebecca thanked him too many times. When he left, silence settled again. But it was no longer the same silence. Now, there was a crack in it. A question, a breadcrumb. At 2001 a.m., Nancy followed Rebecca back to the house with Lily asleep in the back seat, pale now but cooler, wrapped in a blanket printed with faded moons. Night had deepened into that strange blue-black stillness when every porch light looks lonelier and every gas station glows like an island. The roads were mostly empty. Wipers clicked now and then through mist too fine to be called rain. At the house, Nancy carried Lily inside. The child felt lighter than she should have, warm still, but not burning. Her small arms stayed looped around Nancy's neck even in sleep, trusting completely. Nancy laid her gently in bed and tucked the blanket around her. For a second, she just stood there in the darkened room, listening. Humidifier hum, distant refrigerator motor, Rebecca moving softly in the kitchen. The smell of fever had faded. Now it was just laundry detergent, lavender lotion, and the faint syrupy scent of children's cough medicine. Nancy stepped into the hallway. Rebecca was at the kitchen counter pouring water into a glass with both hands, as if she needed both to keep from dropping it. "I found something a few months ago," she said without turning around. Nancy stopped. Rebecca set the glass down. "I didn't know what it meant at the time." The refrigerator clicked on. Light from above the stove made the kitchen look smaller, harsher, every unwashed cup and school paper visible. Rebecca opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Nancy's stomach tightened. "It was in one of the garage cabinets at Dad's," Rebecca said. "I only noticed it because Lily was drawing on everything and I grabbed a stack of papers away from her." She handed the folder over. Nancy opened it. Inside were copies. Property tax records, a refinance packet, 2 pages from what looked like a trust amendment, and 1 photocopied deed summary with a highlighted line. Nancy read it once. Then again. The words swam for half a second before locking into place. Her name. Removed. Years ago. Not during the divorce. Not in the final collapse. Before. Long before. The kitchen seemed to tilt around the edges. "When did you find this?" Nancy asked. "Maybe 6 months ago. I forgot about it until tonight." Rebecca's voice dropped. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't understand what I was looking at." Nancy did not confront Richard right away. That surprised even her. The old Nancy would have either swallowed the pain whole or burst open too early, armed with hurt but not structure. Richard knew how to handle tears. He knew how to out-talk confusion. He knew how to stand in the doorway with one hand in his pocket and make betrayal sound like a scheduling issue. So this time, Nancy did something different. She got organized. The next week smelled like coffee, printer ink, and damp paper. Every morning before driving out to the land, she sat at the little table in her room above the hardware store with the folder Rebecca had given her, a legal pad, and a borrowed pair of reading glasses sliding down her nose. Dawn light came gray through the window. The courthouse clock chimed the half hour. Delivery trucks beeped below on Main Street. She made columns, dates, property changes, refinance records, trust language, who knew what and when. She called the county records office, then the bank. Then an attorney June recommended, not Richard's polished country club lawyer, but a woman in Pittsburgh named Evelyn Cross who wore flat shoes, asked blunt questions, and smelled faintly of peppermint tea and copy paper. Evelyn read in silence for a long time. Nancy sat across from her in a straight-back chair while the office heater clicked and a wind gust rattled the windows. Outside, somebody was burning leaves. The smoky smell drifted in every time the front door opened. Finally, Evelyn set the papers down. "Well," she said, calm as a knife laid on a table, "your ex-husband is either very careless or very practiced." Nancy felt something inside her go still. "Can I prove it?" Evelyn folded her hands. "I think we can prove enough." Enough. Not everything. Not every humiliation. Not every vanished year. Not every dinner swallowed in silence or dream folded smaller to make room for Richard's ambition. But enough. Enough to crack the story open. Nancy looked down at the deed summary again. Her own name stared back at her from old paperwork and then disappeared from newer paperwork, as if she had been erased with clerical neatness. Evelyn tapped the page. This is important, but what matters just as much is the pattern. If he changed the asset structure before separation and then represented the settlement as fair while withholding the context, that matters. Nancy nodded slowly. Evelyn tilted her head. You don't have to decide everything today. Nancy thought about the motel room, the suitcase on the sidewalk, David calling 30,000 generous, Rebecca whispering, I didn't want to see it, Lily burning with fever in her arms, June crouching in the mud saying, because someone should have. Then she thought about the land, the first shoots, the drainage holding, the soil darkening where everyone said nothing good could grow. Nancy lifted her chin. Yes, she said. I do, she told herself. Just make it to spring. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in evidence, in small survivals. In the back corner of the property, the cover crop thickened into a low green veil over the amended patch, softening the clay's hard red glare. Nancy installed the rain catchment system with June's help and only minor swearing. The tarp structure got replaced by something sturdier. A local farm supplier agreed to let her buy compost in smaller loads. Emma from the hardware store started saving cracked seed trays for her, because they're ugly, not useless, which made June laugh for a full minute when Nancy repeated it. And then there was Pickles, who adopted the property as if he had personally financed it. He supervised badly, napped professionally, and once stole an entire biscuit from Nancy's coat pocket with the stealth of a career criminal. Life was not easier. Money stayed tight. Her back still hurt. Some nights loneliness came down so heavy the room above the hardware store felt like a box lowered into the earth. But the rhythm had changed. Nancy was no longer just enduring days. She was building them. Then came the town council breakfast. June insisted she go. Nancy refused twice. June ignored her both times. It's at the church fellowship hall, June said, loading seed sacks into her truck. Half the county will be there pretending the scrambled eggs are edible. Perfect place to meet people. I'm not in the mood to network, Nancy said. June snorted. Honey, wounded women always say that right before they need community. So on a bright Saturday morning in late April, Nancy walked into the fellowship hall in a clean blouse and sensible slacks and immediately smelled coffee, syrup, bacon grease, and floor polish. Folding tables filled the room. Sunlight came through the high windows and white bars. People stood in clusters with paper plates and too loud opinions. Someone's toddler was crying near the muffins. Someone else was laughing hard enough to slap a shoulder. Nancy almost turned around. Then June hooked an elbow through hers and steered her forward. Nope, June murmured. You're not escaping. You need witnesses. Witnesses, that word again. Nancy let herself be introduced. To the feed store owner. To a retired school principal. To a woman who ran the community garden. To a county extension agent who perked up when Nancy mentioned soil rehabilitation. And then, because life enjoys timing more than mercy, Richard walked in. He had on a sport coat, open collar, weekend confidence. Melissa followed beside him, all polished hair and curated warmth, carrying a casserole dish as if she'd been born for church basements and community charm. Nancy felt the air leave her chest for one fast second. Old reflex, old fear. Richard saw her almost immediately. That tiny pause in his step told her everything. He had not expected this version of her. Not here, not upright, not with color in her face and clay still faintly living in the seams of her hands. Melissa recovered first. Her smile widened in that practiced, bright way. Nancy, she said, as if greeting someone at a bridal shower instead of a woman whose home she had stepped into before the porch light cooled. You look well. Nancy met her eyes. The room buzzed around them. Forks against plates, coffee pouring, folding chairs scraping linoleum. The smell of maple syrup and sausage turning slightly too rich in the warm air. "Thank you," Nancy said. Not because Melissa deserved grace, because Nancy no longer needed the scene Melissa expected. Richard stepped in, smooth as ever. "I heard you've been keeping busy." There was the line. Busy. As though what she had built was a hobby to distract her from loss. Before Nancy could answer, June appeared at her side with plate in hand and said cheerfully, "Keeping busy? She's reviving 5 acres of dead clay while uncovering how you shifted property structures before your divorce." Quite a season. Silence landed like a drop tray. It was not total silence. A room never truly goes silent, but the conversation nearest them thinned. Faces turned. Attention changed temperature. Richard's expression barely moved, yet Nancy saw it, the instant calculation behind his eyes. What had been said? Who heard it? Which version of denial should come first? "Excuse me," he said lightly. June took a bite of bacon. "Oh good, we're doing pretending." "June," Nancy said quietly. But June only gave her a side glance that said, "No ma'am, not today." Richard smiled the way men smile before trying to make a woman sound unstable in public. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," and that was when Evelyn Cross, who had apparently arrived 10 minutes earlier and wasted no time choosing a front row seat to human weakness, stepped from the coffee station holding a paper cup. "There is," Evelyn said. But not on Nancy's side. Richard's face changed then. "Just a little. Enough." Melissa looked between them, suddenly unsure how close to stand. Nancy could hear her own pulse in her ears. She could smell percolated coffee, burnt toast, Melissa's expensive perfume, and the clean green scent of cut stems from the Fellowship Hall flower arrangements lining the windowsills. This was the moment. The old identity, the one built to preserve other people's comfort, rose up one last time and whispered, "Not here. Don't make it ugly. Take the high road. Be dignified. Leave quietly." Then Nancy remembered the suitcase. She remembered Lily's burning skin, Rebecca's shaking apology, David's cool voice saying generous, the deed summary, the years, the system. She set down her coffee. "No," she said, and her voice carried farther than she expected. "There wasn't a misunderstanding. There was a strategy." The room went stiller. Richard laughed once under his breath. "Nancy, this is not the place." She looked straight at him. "It became the place when you told our children I accepted that settlement willingly." His jaw tightened. Nancy continued, and now the words came clean. "You changed the ownership structure years before the divorce. You handled the refinance without full disclosure. Then you let everyone believe I gave up my rights to keep the peace." She took one breath. "You didn't just leave me. You edited me out. No shouting, no wild gestures. That made it land harder." Across the room, someone stopped pouring coffee. Rebecca, who had entered quietly just minutes before with Lily on one hip and had been standing near the door in stunned silence, covered her mouth with her hand. Mark stood beside her, eyes fixed on Richard. David wasn't there, but he would hear. Oh, he would hear. Richard glanced around the room, reading the shift and hating it. "You are oversimplifying legal matters you never fully understood." That line, that exact line, the old one, the leash word, the elegant dismissal. Only this time, it did not fit around Nancy's throat. Evelyn took a sip of coffee and said, "I understand them, and I'd be careful repeating that sentence in public." A nervous laugh rippled from somewhere in the room and died quickly. Melissa stepped back then. Small movement, important movement. Distance is its own confession. Richard looked at Nancy again, and for the first time since the suitcase hit the sidewalk, she saw something in his face she had not seen before. Not guilt, not remorse, fear, not of losing her, of losing control of the story. And that, strangely, sharply, was enough. Not justice, but enough. She told herself, just make it to spring. The weeks after that moved like weather after a storm, fast, then strange, then clear in patches. Richard's calls stopped, then started again through lawyers. David called 3 days later. Nancy let it ring twice before answering. His voice was different, less certain. "Mom, Rebecca told me everything." Nancy stood on her property while the morning sun lit the backfield in pale gold. Birds chattered in the hedgerow. The air smelled like wet grass, compost, and something sweet beginning to bloom nearby. "Yes," she said. A long pause. Then, "I'm sorry." Those 2 words did not fix anything. They were not enough for the years, not enough for the phone call, not enough for the easy loyalty he handed his father. But they were real. Nancy closed her eyes briefly. "When you were little," she said, "you used to believe the loudest person in the room knew the truth." David gave a cracked little laugh. "I think maybe I never stopped." "No," Nancy said. "But you can start now," he cried then, quietly. And Nancy let him, not because he had earned immediate peace, because mercy and boundaries can live in the same house once a woman finally owns the deed to herself. Rebecca came more often after that, sometimes with Lily, sometimes alone. Sometimes just to sit on an overturned bucket while Nancy worked and say, "Tell me what this patch is doing," as if relearning her mother required vocabulary. Nancy taught her about soil memory, water paths, the difference between dead and dormant, how the ugliest ground sometimes holds the deepest hunger for life. Lily planted marigolds in a crooked lime and named every single one. Pickles dug up 2 of them and was briefly denounced as a criminal dog. June said that was fair. By May, the back acre had changed color entirely. Green where there had been only glare, texture where there had been hard pan, rose beginning to suggest a future. Nancy stood at the edge of the field one evening while sunset turned the sky apricot and rose over the pines. Crickets started up in the grass. Somewhere far off, a tractor hummed. The warm air smelled like tomato starts, turned earth, and honeysuckle climbing a fence she did not yet own but fully intended to. Rebecca walked up beside her with Lily asleep against her shoulder. "It's beautiful," Rebecca whispered. Nancy looked out over the land. "No," she said softly. "It's becoming." And maybe that was better, because beautiful sounds finished. This was alive. By June, people in town had started referring to the property by a name Nancy never chose but somehow fit anyway, Mitchell Spring. It began as a joke, then a shorthand, then a fact. The dry land Nancy bought in winter had become a small but stubborn local project. Soil recovery, starter beds, rain catchment, seasonal vegetables, native pollinator strips. The extension office sent interns twice. The church garden group asked if she'd speak. Emma from the hardware store brought friends out one Saturday and called Nancy the coolest grandma in Chatham County, which June insisted on having put on a sign. Nancy laughed more now, not constantly, not theatrically, but from the center. The kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission on its way out. One evening, after everyone left, she walked the property alone. Golden light slanted low across the rows. The irrigation barrels glowed amber. Leaves moved in the breeze with a soft, papery whisper. The world smelled green, wet stems, warm soil, basil, mulch, and the faint peppery bite of marigolds opening for the night. Nancy stopped near the patch where she had first crouched months ago and touched the ground. Cool on top now, richer beneath. Alive. She thought of that first day. The cracked suitcase wheel, the motel's bleach smell, the pink-blue vacancy sign, the phone calls that made her feel erased. Then she thought of now, June's laugh, Lily's marigolds, Rebecca listening, David trying, Pickles snoring under the shade table. Her own name on documents she actually understood. The promise had not been that life would return to what it was. Thank God. The promise had been smaller, stranger, holier, that she would survive long enough to meet the woman on the other side. Nancy stood as dusk settled over the land and whispered the line that had carried her from winter to here. Just make it to spring. Then she smiled and shook her head, because spring had come, and they knew who she was now. Not Richard's ex-wife, not the woman with the suitcase, not the one who got 30,000 and disappeared. Nancy Mitchell. The woman who took abandoned ground and made it answer back. The woman who was written out and wrote herself in again. The woman who learned, too late for innocence but not too late for life, that being chosen by others is not the same thing as belonging to yourself. The last light slipped behind the trees. Crickets rose louder. The air cooled against her skin. Somewhere in the dark, water moved softly through the catchment line she had built with her own aching hands, and Nancy turned toward home.